There was a boy in Aberdeen, Washington, who learned very early that his body was an unreliable home. Not in the way most children learn this through a scraped knee or a winter cold, but in a deeper, more persistent way. From the time Kurt Cobain was 15 years old, his stomach hurt. Not occasionally, not on bad days. Every single morning, he woke up to the same dull, grinding presence in his gut, as if something inside him was slowly being wrung out like a wet cloth. Doctors examined him. Doctors dismissed him. Specialists shrugged. The medical establishment of small-town America in the 1980s had no category for what Kurt was experiencing, and so they handed him a clean bill of health and sent him back into a body that felt like a trap. What happened next took years to unfold, and most people who know the name Kurt Cobain have never heard this part of the story. The world knows the flannel shirts, the distortion pedals, the screaming anthems that tore through the early 1990s like a weather event. The world knows the MTV Unplugged performance and the haunted eyes beneath the unwashed hair. But very few people know what it actually felt like to be inside that body, to wake up every day and force yourself to eat, only to feel the food come back up, to sit in silence on the floor of a tour bus while 60,000 people waited for you outside, and to think, quietly and without drama, that you simply did not want to continue existing. That thought, not suicidal in a theatrical sense, but in the slow, exhausted way of someone who has run out of tolerance for pain, lived with Kurt Cobain for years before anyone put a name to it. The connection between physical suffering and the substance that eventually consumed Kurt's public image has been collapsed into a single word, addiction, and that word carries all the moral weight of a choice. But the timeline tells a different story. Kurt described his relationship with heroin not as rebellion, not as rock star excess, not even as escape in the recreational sense. He described it as the first morning in years he woke up without feeling like he was dying. That is a profoundly different thing, and it changes the entire architecture of how his story should be understood. For nearly a decade, he had been searching for something that worked. He had tried everything a person without a diagnosis tries: dietary changes, over-the-counter remedies, the stoic endurance that gets praised as strength until it breaks a person entirely. None of it worked. And then something did. The fact that this something came with catastrophic consequences does not retroactively transform his pain into performance or his self-medication into vanity. Kurt himself was lucid about this, in a way that most public narratives about him choose to ignore. He spoke about heroin without romance, without the leather jacket mythology that the press was so eager to construct around it. He called it boring. He said that after a few months, any drug becomes as mundane as breathing. He was not describing a seducer. He was describing a tool he had reached for because the alternative, eating 3 meals a day while silently weeping from abdominal pain, forcing himself onto stages, performing joy for crowds who needed him to be their generation's voice, had become genuinely unsustainable. He resented the narrative that was built around his drug use, not because it was untrue, but because it was incomplete. It stripped away the part of the story that might have generated sympathy instead of judgment. It turned a medical crisis into a character flaw, and Kurt was sharp enough to see exactly what was being done, even as he lacked the platform or the energy to fully correct it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to people who are famous for the wrong reasons, and Kurt Cobain inhabited it with the thoroughness of someone who had no choice. He had come from the punk underground, from basement shows and photocopied zines, and a musical culture that defined itself explicitly against the machinery of mainstream success. When Nevermind arrived in September 1991 and proceeded to dismantle the Billboard charts, displacing Michael Jackson from the #1 position in a development that shocked even the people who had signed the record, Kurt did not experience this as vindication. He experienced it as a category error of cosmic proportions. The album, in his view, misrepresented him. It was too polished, too accessible, too easily consumed by exactly the kind of audience he had spent his entire artistic life rejecting. He would spend the remaining years of his life trying to correct this impression, and he would largely fail because the machinery of pop culture is not designed to receive corrections. The flannel shirts that became a fashion trend, the distortion that got sanitized into radio-friendly grunge, the anger that got repackaged into a marketable aesthetic, all of it felt to Kurt like a kind of translation so aggressive it amounted to mistranslation. He had wanted to make something that cost the listener something. Instead, he had inadvertently created a soundtrack for shopping malls. He continued wearing second-hand clothes after becoming a millionaire, not as a pose, but because the genuine pleasure of finding something unexpected in a bin for $3 felt more real to him than the hollow ease of buying whatever he wanted. He told people this. He explained himself, repeatedly with a directness that should have made the journalism easy, and yet the image that solidified in the public imagination was the reluctant icon who rejected fame while secretly craving it, which was almost entirely wrong and deeply unfair to a person who was genuinely philosophically opposed to what he had accidentally become. Kurt described himself as too sensitive rather than too intelligent, and there is precision in that self-diagnosis that deserves attention. He watched people around him move through their lives with an ease he found genuinely enviable, people who could enjoy a beer in front of a sports broadcast without the entire weight of self-consciousness pressing down on them, people who did not lie awake reconstructing conversations, people whose nervous systems did not treat ordinary public existence as a sustained emergency. He envied them without condescension. He understood that simplicity was its own form of intelligence, its own valid relationship with the world. What he could not do was access it himself, and the fame that descended on him in his mid-20s made this baseline sensitivity catastrophically worse. The worship, the people who approached him trembling, who treated his presence as a religious event, who wanted to consume him rather than simply appreciate what he had made, repelled him in a way that was almost physical. He found it embarrassing in the precise dictionary sense, something that caused him genuine distress and disorientation. He was not performing humility. He was describing an accurate experience of a social situation that his nervous system was constitutionally unable to tolerate. And this is where the story of Kurt Cobain becomes something beyond the grunge mythology, something that resonates across 3 decades because it describes a predicament that has not gone away. What happens to a person who is too porous for the world they have accidentally entered, who absorbs everything and filters nothing, who cannot develop the protective layer that fame seems to require for survival? The part of Kurt Cobain's story that gets least attention in the conspiracy theories and the posthumous diagnoses and the endless debates about what really happened in April 1994 is the part where he loved his daughter. This is not a sentimental addendum. It is in many ways the structural center of his last years, the thing that created the most acute contradiction in his situation. He said plainly, and without apparent calculation, that Frances Bean gave him a reason to want to live, that having a child to raise transformed his relationship to the future in a way nothing else had managed to do. He had been deeply negative before her birth, reflexively apocalyptic in the way that young people who have suffered sometimes are, convinced that bringing a child into a broken world was an act of cruelty. Love changed that position for him. Frances changed it further. And yet the same period that contained this genuine transformation also contained the escalating chaos of a life that was not being managed well by anyone around it, the medical crisis still undiagnosed and untreated, the drug dependency still being addressed with intervention strategies that were not working, the media environment still constructing a narrative that had very little to do with the person inside it. Kurt existed in this contradiction with a clarity that seems almost unbearable in retrospect. He knew what he wanted. He wanted to raise his daughter. He wanted to eventually sit in a chair with an acoustic guitar and be thought of as a songwriter rather than a spectacle, to age into something like Johnny Cash, dignified, unhurried, no longer required to perform explosion. He had a vision of his own future that was modest and specific and entirely plausible. The gap between that vision and what actually happened is not best explained by character weakness. It is best explained by a healthcare system that failed him, a media environment that consumed him, and a body that had been in revolt for more than half his life. What the transcript of Kurt Cobain's own words reveals, the actual sentences he spoke when he was given time and relative quiet to articulate his experience, is a person of considerable self-awareness who was also genuinely out of options in the ways that mattered most. He knew his drug use was stupid. He said so. He knew it was not a solution. He said that too. He knew that the junkie mythology being built around him was both inaccurate and harmful, and he objected to it with the specificity of someone who had thought carefully about the difference between what he was doing and why he was doing it, and what the press was claiming he was doing and why they were claiming it. He understood that he had become a symbol for his generation in a way he had never sought and could not control. He understood that this symbolism would outlast him and attach itself to his name regardless of what he actually said or did or intended. What he perhaps did not fully understand or understood but could not act on was that the combination of chronic physical pain, inadequately treated mental health, dependency, fame, and the particular pressures of his domestic situation had created a situation that required systemic intervention rather than individual willpower. He kept trying to manage it himself, or to manage it with the limited tools available to him in an era when mental health treatment for public figures was primitive at best and punitive at worst. He lied about the drugs for years because he did not want to influence anyone toward them, a protective instinct that also cut him off from the kind of honest help that transparency might have enabled. He was trying to be responsible for other people's well-being at the same time that his own was collapsing, and that particular inversion of care, putting the audience's needs above the self, is both understandable and devastating in equal measure. The conversation around Kurt Cobain has shifted in the decades since his death, and some of what has shifted is genuinely important. The chronic pain he described is now understood as a real and serious condition, the kind of undiagnosed gastric suffering that drives people toward self-medication is documented, studied, and increasingly treated with the seriousness it deserves. The connection between undertreated physical pain and substance dependency is no longer a fringe theory, but a central insight of addiction medicine. The idea that a person might reach for heroin, not because they are reckless or weak, but because nothing else has worked and the pain is genuinely intolerable. This idea has entered mainstream consciousness in a way it simply had not in 1993. Kurt was describing something real. He was describing it accurately. The world was not yet equipped to hear it. His daughter Frances, who grew up without him and with full access to everything he left behind, the journals, the recordings, the notes, has said that her father was a sick man, not a bad one. That distinction is not just generosity. It is precision. It is the most accurate description available of what the evidence shows. A man in chronic pain who found inadequate relief in a dangerous place, who was too sensitive for the environment he inhabited, who loved his child and wanted a simpler future, who was failed by the systems around him at every critical juncture. That man deserves a more honest account than the mythology has generally offered. And perhaps the most important thing his story continues to offer, 30 years on, is this: the people around you who are in pain and reaching for the wrong things are not always choosing badly. Sometimes they are choosing from a menu that should never have been the only one available. If you recognize something in this story, the chronic pain that no one takes seriously, the self-medication that seems like the only option, the sensitivity that makes ordinary life feel overwhelming, you are not alone, and you are not weak, and there are people equipped to help in ways that were not available to Kurt Cobain in 19. That is his legacy too. Not just the music, extraordinary as it is, the conversation he started by refusing to pretend he was fine,